Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. This is episode 18, and we're delighted this week to be joined by one of Scotland's leading prosecutors, Iain Mc Sporran, who, as well as being marvellous in court, is also an aficionado of Burns and is going to be talking to us today at this timely point with Burns Night coming up about Tam Shanter and specifically the witch section in Tam Shanter. So we're going to have that today as our guest. So we're looking forward to that. But before we do that, we'd like to talk about the three witches that we've got for this week to remember them and have their names said so we can think of them as people. So the first person we've got this week is Florence Sim. Now, she was prosecuted in 1650. She was from Kirkliston and she was tried in Dalkeith. She was a female, she was unmarried, and the outcome is not known. But there is a specific reason why you've chosen Florence for this week, isn't there, Claire?
Yes, what happened was I was scrolling through Instagram and I came across, as I do on my feed, the Medicine Spoon Memorial. And I saw a beautiful spoon that had been stitched for Florence Sim. Her name's spelt slightly differently, and you find that in these old records that they're sort of adaptations of names. We have her as Florence Sim, and they have it as Florentia Sim. But they are both the women from the same area who had a trial at the same time in 1650. But in posting the Medicine Spoon Memorial, Karen has written underneath it, Florentia Sim, I wonder what you were like, the colour of your hair, what made you giggle, what were you good at, the colour of your eyes, were you a mother, what's your story? Thank you for this spoon, for remembering Flo, her name has been brought into the light. So I just thought it was lovely that I saw that really pretty spoon and thought we could remember her as well. And also to provide a reminder to people who have got any of the spoons, and I am one of those included, that...
Me too.
Have you got your spoon to finish as well?
I've not done mine either. No, I need to get on with it.
Yeah, well, we do need to get on with it because now Karen's moved to the next part of her work, which is bringing together all the different spoons to make it one item. And she had set a time limit for returning the work, but then she realised that setting a time limit, she said, it felt kind of artificial. So she is just going to allow the spoons to come in over a period of time after the time limit, and she's still going to include them all. So if you do have any memorial spoons that you want to get back to the Memorial Spoon Memorial, just a wee reminder to help you to get your spoon finished. I'm almost finished mine.
Oh, very good. You're on it. I'll have a go at mine this afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah. The next person we have is a man this week, and it's Thomas Peyton. He was tried in November 1650 in Dumfries. Now, he was married, and it says here trial executed, which I presume means that he was killed. And again, just a reminder that in Scotland, it was 85% of the witches, or so-called witches, that were executed were female, and it was about 80% through Europe. So it was a slightly higher, 5% higher rate of women in Scotland as opposed to the rest of Europe. So that was Thomas Peyton. And then thirdly, we've got Margaret Porteous, who gave a confession, which, Claire, you're going to read out, aren't you?
Yes, we have some note on the confession of Margaret Porteous. And Margaret Porteous was one of the women who was alleged to have been a witch in the Witches of Liberton trial of 1661. And Margaret was said to have made a confession. And I'll read it out to you. It says, Margaret Porteous confessed about 4 years since that the devil appeared to her in her own house about 10 o'clock at night in the likeness of a man, and bade her renounce her baptism and be his servant, and she should have all the pleasures of the earth, and she did renounce her baptism and promised to be servant, and since he's deleted several others. Now, I'm not quite sure, Zoe, what that last bit refers to, and since he's deleted several others. But we see the recurring theme there, Zoe.
That's weird.
Yeah, of women having to renounce their baptism. That's the important thing about that women couldn't be sworn to the devil having been baptised, so there must be some way around that and the way of renouncing their baptism. Although here it doesn't actually say how it was carried out, it just said she renounced her baptism. We know the whole story that we've had before about who places whose, whether or not it's the devil places his hand on the head or the feet of the woman, or whether it's the women that place their own hand on their head and foot. And remember, we had someone recently write into us and show us the book where it says that the women put their hand on their head and their hand on their foot. And I thought, oh well, I was definitely wrong. And then I saw a picture of Lilias Adey and a description of what she had described of the renouncing of her baptism, and it was a picture of the devil holding her by her head and her foot. So I think even then there was confusion about how that happened.
And that illustration that you saw, that's from those times. It's not a recent illustration, is it? It's a very old one. So it's an interpretation of what it was then. Yeah, it was an interpretation. Yeah.
Of course, that person could have interpreted it wrongly like me and thought, oh, it's the devil that does that, when it's the women themselves.
Also, we need to remember the fact that probably there probably wasn't a devil. There probably wasn't a devil. And these were probably just women and there was no devil, and they made it up to save themselves, and it became a narrative that was told socially and spread, and people knew that that was what you said in your confession.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were dancing with the devil, then you would know that you had to renounce your baptism. That was something that you had to say. But so the three people you remember today are Florence Sim, Thomas Peyton and Margaret Porteous.
So now we go over to Iain Mc Sporran QC, who's going to be talking to us about Tam o' Shanter and the witches therein.
We are absolutely delighted to bring to you today one of Scotland's most eminent QCs. He worked as Defence Counsel, but latterly has worked for many years as a senior prosecuting QC. You might recognise him if you recognise his voice. You might recognise it from his recent role as star of the BAFTA award winning The Trial, where Iain was the prosecutor. Amongst his many talents is an interest in the bard, and he is an aficionado of Robert Burns. The reason that we have him on to speak to us today is because he is going to speak to us today about what we at Witches of Scotland are most interested in, and that's the recording of histories of people, and the way in this particular case that the bard recorded a fictional meeting between Tam and a number of witches. Welcome, Iain, to the Witches of Scotland podcast.
Well, good morning, Claire and Zoe, and everyone who's listening. Claire will be horrified if I point out that she neglected to introduce me by my full name because she got flustered in her first take. So I'll do that. Iain Mc Sporran QC. I'd rather Iain, so she's introduced me as Iain, and that's absolutely fine. She also introduced me as a star of a BAFTA award-winning documentary. It would be splitting hairs to point out that it's a double BAFTA award-winning. So I'll set out my stall there, and it's all downhill from here. So I'm very pleased to have been asked to contribute to this fascinating series of podcasts on a subject which is completely new to me, but which I have found very interesting, informative, educational, and perhaps to an extent transformative in my views as to what should be done about historical wrongs and whether we should trouble ourselves to remedy them. And I've come very firmly to the view, thanks to the work of Claire and Zoe and others, that we should indeed remedy them and do something about it. So if the podcast has got one convert, then it's me, and I'm therefore very pleased to contribute. I'm not, however, going to contribute about the dreadful sides of the persecution of witches, rather the relatively entertaining aspect as we come towards Burns Night of his epic masterpiece, Tam o' Shanter. And it's right to say I'm an aficionado of Burns, not an expert. So if anyone picks over this podcast and points out many things I get wrong, they're welcome to do so. I won't be at all offended. Since we're at Burns season and since we're talking about witches, I'll start by starting with Burns. We know something about Burns' upbringing and history from an autobiographical letter he wrote in 1787, which set out his life to that point. And for our purposes, what's important is he tells us, "In my infant and boyish days, too, I owed much to an old woman who resided in the family, remarkable for her ignorance, credulity, and superstition. She had, I suppose, the largest collection in the country of tales and songs concerning devils, ghosts, fairies, brownies, witches, warlocks, spunkies, kelpies, elf candles, deadlights, wraiths, apparitions, cantrips, giants, enchanted towers, dragons, and other trumpery." So there we have it. In 1787, the word trumpery was associated with ignorance, credulity, and superstition. Who would have thought it? He goes on, "This cultivated the latent seeds of poetry, but had so strong an effect on my imagination that to this hour, in my nocturnal rambles, I sometimes keep a sharp lookout in suspicious places, and though nobody can be more sceptical than I am in such matters, yet it often takes an effort of philosophy to shake off these idle terrors." And so we may take it that whilst Burns was a man of the Scottish Enlightenment, inspired by it and part of it, the rational, the logical, the empirical, it may be that he was never able completely to shake off those terrors, and that perhaps renders Tam O'Shanter all the more powerful and convincing, because maybe he had some residual belief in the truth of the scenes he was describing. I won't pretend that that's philosophy or theory that's capable of being tested, but he comes from an upbringing in which a very important source of inspiration to him was this woman, Betty Davidson, who was essentially a part of the extended family. His mother, Agnes Brown, too, was of the folk tradition and the stories of that time. So he had a lot of that coming into him, as well as the education which was provided to him by his father. So he's learning French and Latin and great literature, but he's also learning the other side of life, and that undoubtedly combined in much of his work, and certainly in Tam O'Shanter. The story, for those unfamiliar with it, can perhaps be best summarised in a prose version which he provided at the request of a man called Francis Grose, an antiquarian, who asked him for any ghost stories he may know connected to Alloway Kirk for a book which Grose had planned. And Burns replied, saying he had 2 or 3 stories, one of which he says, and I'm summarising this so as not to be too tedious, but he says, "A story which I can prove to be equally authentic was as follows. On a market day in the town of Ayr, a farmer from Carrick had been detained by his business, till by the time he reached Alloway, it was the wizard hour between night and morning. Though he was terrified by a blaze streaming from the kirk, he prudently advanced on his road. He was surprised and entertained to see a dance of witches merrily footing it around with their sooty blackguard master, who was keeping them alive with the sound of his bagpipe. The ladies were all in their smocks, and one of them happening unluckily to have a smock which was considerably too short to answer all the purpose of that piece of dress, he involuntarily burst out with a loud laugh, "Wheel luppin' Maggie with the short sack," and instantly spurred his horse to the top of his speed. I need not mention the universally known fact that no diabolical power can pursue you beyond the middle of a running stream. Against the odds, he reached the middle of the arch of the bridge. The pursuing vengeful hags were so close at his heels that one of them actually sprung to seize him, but it was too late. Nothing was on her side of the stream but the horse's tail, which immediately gave way to her infernal grip. However, the unsightly, tailless condition of the vigorous steed was, to the last hour of the noble creature's life, awful warning to the Carrick farmers not to stay too late in Ayr markets. So it's from that simple tale, which you may have heard from the lady I mentioned or otherwise, that he created one of the greatest narrative poems in the English or perhaps any language, Tam O'Shanter tale.
What I like about what you've told me is I hadn't ever thought till this moment that the story of Tam O'Shanter, I'm thinking about who would have come up with such a story, why they would have done so, and it seemed to me that the women waiting at home for their husbands to come home would be well to do to give them a warning that they couldn't come home too late or they might be assailed by devils and witches. It perhaps came from the women of the household to ensure their husbands got home on time.
Well, that's a possibility. That, as you know, early on in the poem, we have Kate's prophecy as to what will happen to Tam if he does not behave himself. So we'll move on to the poem now that we know where it comes from. We start off with a description of Ayr on a market day, people concluding their business and then repairing to the hostelries, one of whom is Tam of Shanter Farm, Tam of Shanter. And he decides to enjoy himself with a bit too much beer, in great company. There's song, there's chat, he's chatting up the landlady, he's having a great time with his old pal, Suitor Johnny. But of course, we're reminded right at the outset that at hame there sits our sulky, sullen dame, gathering her brows like gathering storm, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. And I think that's a tremendous image, and it's one which I've certainly been responsible for at times in the past. We go on. The author in the preamble reminds Tam, "O Tam, hadst thou but been so wise as ta'en thy ain wife Kate's advice, she told thee weel thou was a skellum, a blethering, blustering, drunken blellum that frae November till October, a market day thou wasna sober. It was on she prophesied that late or soon thou would be found deep drooned in Doon, or catched wi' warlocks in the muck by Alloway's old haunted cup." And it turns out there's something very similar is exactly what happens, and not for the first time. The wife was to be right. So we then move on to the description of the light and the noise and the hilarity in the pub itself. I'm not going to go through all of that because we want to get to the bit where the witches are, but the tone at this stage is of great enjoyment, great fun, and then the tone changes gently and then quite dramatically. It changes, first of all, pleasures are like poppies spread, you seize the flower its bloom is shed, or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white then melts forever, or like the borealis race that flit ere you can point their place, or like the rainbow's lovely form, you vanishing amid the storm. Nae man can tether time nor tide, the hour approaches, Tam on ride. So the hilarity's over, he's got to get home at some point. And then this line, a brilliant description, one that actually raises the hairs on the back of my neck. That hour, o night's black arch the keystone, that dreary hour he mounts his beast in, and sick a night he tacks the road in, as ne'er poor sinner was abroad in. So that hour, o night's black arch the keystone, I think is a fantastic way of describing the darkest hour of the middle of the night. And we go to the arch of another physical bridge at the end of the poem, of course. So it's introduced there as a concept. And there's another beautiful piece, I think, which, if you think about it, just gives you the shivers, describing the stormy night he's going out in. The wind blew as 'twould blow on its last, the rattling showers rose on the blast, the speedy gleams the darkness swallowed, loud, deep, and lang the thunder bellowed. That night, a child might understand, the deil had business on its hand. So, from the hilarity in the pub, we've now got a distinctly less cheerful scene. It goes on to describe the journey that Tam embarks upon on his loyal mare, Meg or Maggie, and he's very well aware in the darkness of the possibility of ghosts being in the air. And before we even reach the church, his journey takes him across the ford where in the snow the chapman snored, and past the birks in Meeklestane where drunken Charlie Brack's neck bane, and through the winds and by the cairn where hunters found the murdered bairn, and near the thorn aboon the well where Mungo's mither hanged herself. Even before we get to the haunted church, his journey takes him past a place where a man has smothered in the snow, a man has accidentally broken his neck, a murdered child has been found, and the woman has killed herself. So we're not in a happy place anymore. Then he sees the most astonishing thing. When glimmering through the groaning trees, Kirk Alloway seemed in a bleeze. Through ilka bore the beams were glancing, and loud resounded mirth and dancing. An astonishing scene to come across at what was already a ruined churchyard beyond his journey. We now find the importance of alcohol in the whole thing. He's got very drunk, obviously, at the pub, and what on earth would make him go on into the church rather than pass it, but inspiring bold John Barleycorn, whisky. What dangers thou canst make us scorn. With tippenny, we fear nae evil, so with beer, we fear nae evil. With Usquebaugh, you'll face the devil. That's whisky's so much more inspiring than mere beer. So on he spurs his horse into the scene. And wow, Tam saw an uncouth sight. So now we get our first glimpse of the witches. And I'll simply read, if I may, in full, this key scene. Warlocks and witches in a dance. Nay, cotillon brent you frae France, but hornpipes, jigs, raspays and reels put life and metal in their heels. A winnock bunker in the east, there sat old Nick in shape of beast. Housey type, black, grim and large, to gie them music was his charge. He screwed the pipes and gat them skirl, till roof and rafters added dirl. Coffins stood round like open presses, that showed the deed in their last dresses, and by some devilish cantrip slight, each in its cold hand held a light, by which heroic Tam was able to note upon the haly table a murderer's banes in gibbet airns, twa span lang wee unchristened bairns, a thief new cutted frae a rape, with his last gasp his gab did gape, 5 tomahawks with blood red rusted, 5 scimitars with murder crusted, a garter which a babe had strangled, a knife a father's throat had mangled, whom his ain son o' life bereft, the grey hairs yet stuck to the heft. 3 lawyers' tongues turned inside out, wi' lies seemed like a beggar's clout. 3 priests' hearts, rotten, black as muck, lay stinking vile in every nook, wi' mair of horrible and awful, which even to name would be unlawful. Now I pause to observe that the description of lawyers' tongues and priests' hearts appears in the original manuscript version of the poem, but Burns was encouraged by one of his patrons to delete that, and it's very rarely printed now, other than as an explanatory marginal note, and it's not often recited. It's usually recited if there are lawyers or priests or clergy present to embarrass them, but it perhaps gives an insight into the way in which Burns viewed certain members of the legal profession and the clergy. Although one of his very best friends and supporters was a lawyer, so he wasn't against all lawyers. Although Tam O'Shanter is often given as a comic entertaining piece, it's not. That this is a pretty horrific description to see within a church.
You forget how unpleasant Tam O'Shanter actually is. I mean, I've taught bits of it as an English teacher quite a long time ago, but I have taught bits of it. But I think that the bits that the kids actually often enjoy is what is like the bit you've just read, because it's so gory and grim, and it's really over the top. There's so many items there. It's fantastic. But you do forget that, and it's really, this is another aspect of this podcast that's really kind of illuminated to me, is we take so many things, I think, in our Scottish culture for granted. So we all sort of think, witches, we think Tam O'Shanter, we all did it at primary school, most of us did it at primary school. But I haven't really thought about it, and I've not really thought about the two things together properly before. And if this really does give an indication of the fear, the very kind of real sort of belief in the supernatural, this really sort of illustrates it for me so clearly. It's great to hear you read it, actually. Your voice is brilliant. It's really very effective.
That's very kind. It's true, however, worth bearing in mind that Burns was born in 1759. This poem was written in 1790.
Yeah.
In the same century as the last witches were executed. And an intelligent man like Burns had residual superstitions. The ignorant, uneducated would have no notion they were mere superstitions. There would still be beliefs abroad as to the reality of the spirit world, the supernatural, and witches. I'm guessing. I'm not a historian, so I can't say whether that's absolutely right. But it's so close in time. We're here in 2021, but this is written so close in time to an era when your podcast is telling us, your whole website is telling us, persecution on a grand scale had only recently been occurring in our country. That I don't want to be too serious about it, because it is an entertainment above all else. But it's, I think, definitely important to remember just how awful the scenes he's describing are, and how they would have resonated more perhaps with people of that era than of ours. We're now having the horrors. We're now going to get to the dancing. Before I read this bit, again, for those who maybe don't know the poem, and I'm sure there are plenty of you who know it very well, so I'm sorry for if this sounds patronising, but he watches then as the dancing goes on, and the speed of the dancing and the speed that you're forced to narrate the poem explains why the witches become so hot and sweaty that they cast off their outer clothing and then dance on in their nightshirts, their vests, their shifts, their whatever you want to call them, but a light, a sark is how it's described. And it's important, again, for those who might not know the language, a cutty sark is a short shift, a short dress. And that's important because after Burns describes the witches in general terms, in very disparaging, pleasant terms, he then focuses on the most important witch of all, who happens, and the purposes of this poem, fortunately, happens to be wearing very much. So he goes on, as Tammy glowered, amazed and curious, the mirth and fun grew fast and furious, the piper loud and louder blew, the dancers quick and quicker flew, they reeled, they set, they crossed, they cleek till Ilka Carlin swat and reek it, and pushed their duddies to the wark, and link it at it in her sack. Now, Tam, oh Tam, had they been queens, plump and strapping in their teens, their sacks, instead of creasy flannin, been snow-white 1700 linen, their breeks o' mine, my only pair, that ains were plush o' good blue hair, I would have given them off my hardies, for a blink o' the bonny birdies. But wither beldams, auld and droll, red woody hags would spin a foal, louping and flinging on a crummock, it's a wonder didn't I turn my stomach. But Tam kenned what was what through Brawley. There was a winsome wench and Wally that night enlisted in the corps, lang after kenned on Carrick shore, for many a beast to dead she shot, and perished mony a bonny boat, and shook baith meikle corn and bear, and kept the countryside in fear. Her cutty sack, Paisley harm, but while a lassie she had worn, in longitude, though sorely scanty, it was her best, she was vaunty. Little kenned thy reverend granny, that sack she coughed for her wee Nanny, with twa pun spots, was a her riches, would ever graced a dance witches. Here my muse her wing maun cower, sick flights are far beyond her power, to sing how Nanny lap and flang, a supple jad she was and strang, and how Tam stood like ane bewitched, and thought his very een enriched. Even Satan glowered and fidged through fane, and hotched and blew wi' might and main, till first a caper, syne another, Tam tint his reason a' together, and roars out, "Well done, cutty sack!" And in an instant, all was dark, and scarcely had he Maggie rallied, when out the hellish legion sallied. So, he's been so inspired by this young witch, this young scantily clad, attractive witch, that he forgets himself and cries out, and as soon as the presence of a mortal human is known, all the lights, all the noise, everything stops. I love that. And in an instant, all was dark. And now he's very quickly realised he'd better get out of there. He's rallied his horse, and the hellish legion sallies out. There's a description then of how they all follow after him, screeching and threatening. Tam, they'll get thy fairn, in hell they'll roast thee like a hern. In vain thy Kate awaits thy coming, Kate soon will be a woeful woman. Now, do thy speedy utmost, Meg, and win the keystane of the brig. They're at them now, thy tail may toss, a running stream they darena cross. But ere the keystane she could make, the fiend a tail she had to shake, for Nanny, far before the rest, hard upon noble Maggie pressed, and flew at Tam with furious ettle. But little wist she Maggie's mettle. A spring brought off her master hale, but left behind her ain grey tail. The carlin clocked her by the rump, and left poor Maggie scarce a stump. So that's chase has happened, just as we have in the prose narrative version. And the important thing is to get to the keystane of the brig. Now, we'll remember that hour o' night's black arch, the keystane. Well, now we have a literal keystane. As long as he's over the halfway point of the bridge, the supernatural powers have no power on him. The witch cannot cross a running stream. And Maggie just makes it. The tail's left on the wrong side of the keystane of the brig, so poor old Maggie loses her tail, but loyal, noble Maggie brings her master across safely. And there's a moral to the whole story, of course. And it involves men who think that taking drink and chasing after scantily clad young women is a worthwhile pursuit. Now, why this tale of truth shall read, ilk man and mother's son, take heed. Whene'er to drink you are inclined, or cutty sarks run in your mind, think you may buy the joys o'er dear, remember Tam O'Shanter's wear. And that's a warning which the men of Scotland have taken from that day to this very seriously and avoided strong drink and scantily clad young women. And that's Tam O'Shanter.
Iain, thank you so much for that. That is a brilliant gallop through Tam O'Shanter. I like many of the same phrases as you, and I think my very phrase is the shout of "Well done, Cutty Sark," and in a moment all was dark, because you were caught up with the frenzy of the words, the fact that he was watching them dancing around in a whirling dervish, that there was lights, there was sound, there was things flying about everywhere, and then he's propelled into that immediate darkness, and you're sitting with them in that immediate darkness with that chill of fear of what's going to happen to you.
Often as it's performed at Burns suppers, I've seen people bring along a huge holdall full of props, so to represent the witches and to represent the Spanlandia and christened bairns and so on. And my heart always sinks, because the words and the rhythm of the poem tell you the whole story. And we even have, it's a cliche now that when we get to the bit about "in an instant all was dark," the person reciting it will often have someone trying to switch off all the lights in the place. And I think, what is it about the words that you didn't really get without some demonstration of it? But I'm perhaps being too pious.
You're a purist, Iain.
A purist is just another word for crashing bore. But either way, that's what I am when it comes to a Burns supper. Again, for the benefit of those listening who may not know all about the thing, Tam O'Shanter, first of all, is the name given to a bonnet or a cloth cap. And it is named after the poem. The poem wasn't named after the Tam O'Shanter. So people around the world, because the Tam O'Shanter is a cap which was exported, will find it worn in America. So when Tam is holding fast his good blue bonnet as he's making his way away from the pub, that's the bonnet which became the Tam O'Shanter. Cutty Sark, many will recognise as the name of a sailing ship, one of the tea clippers. It was launched in 1869 and was named after Cutty Sark, from the chap who owned the boat. Was a fan of Burns' poem, so that's where that came from. And then in due course, Cutty Sark whisky was launched onto the market in 1923, and it in turn is named after the ship and carries a sailing ship in full sail on the label. So there's some trivia for you, where the Tam O'Shanter bonnet and the Cutty Sark comes from. Have you ever tried a Cutty Sark whisky? I'll be honest and say no, and that's not really, I'm not being snobbish about it. There's so many whiskies on the market. Cutty Sark, I think, is generally for the export market. I think you'll find it more readily in America than you will here. But it's a blended whiskey, so if there was no malt left, I would go and look out a Cutty Sark. But again a crashing bore. On a slightly more serious observation then, I mentioned earlier on how your website, podcasts and other publicity about the Witches of Scotland has led me to review my view on whether we should do anything about historical wrongs. And it strikes me that in the old cemetery in Edinburgh, which too few people visit, most fascinating place on earth, the memorial to Hume stands beside the amazing statue of President Lincoln with the freed slave at his feet reaching up in gratitude. And in recent times, of course, we found that Hume, his legacy and his connection with the slave trade has become problematic. And in America, I know there are demands that statues of Lincoln with slaves on their knees or kneeling up in gratitude, there are demands for them to be removed. And I wonder how long it will be before that same demand comes for this astonishing. You walk into this old cemetery and find this amazing sculpture and statue of Lincoln and the slave. So not comparing the witches campaign with the campaign about the slave trade, but there must be some parallels there. And they're looking, first of all, to the Martyrs' Monument for Thomas Muir and others. So there's liberty and the fight for liberty there. But Lincoln's then looking further down the road towards Burns' monument on Carlton Hill, which in turn overlooks the churchyard on the Canongate, where we find the grave of Robert Ferguson, an Edinburgh poet who truly inspired Burns and for whom Burns wrote the inscription on his memorial, and the grave of Clorinda, or Agnes MacLehose, his great illicit love when he was in Edinburgh. And to square the circle, as it were, of course, Burns seriously contemplated emigration to Jamaica, where his role would have been as an overseer on a plantation worked by slaves. And does that taint Burns's legacy and memory? It may well do, because one thing I'm very keen on in relation to Burns is not to be one of those who have been described in the past as bardolaters, who idolise him, worship him. I very much see Burns warts and all. He could be a terrible human being, yet capable of producing high art. And I'm not raising this to give an answer. I'm simply raising the question. If we look back and examine the lives of people considered to be great, are we prepared to accept that there are aspects of their lives which will not withstand scrutiny? And if we are to memorialise the witches who were murdered, and we must consider how to deal with the nation's history vis-à-vis slavery, then we can't ignore that Burns and other great members of the Enlightenment have connections with that. So there you are. I'm just giving you a kind of, my view is that there are issues which arise when we consider Burns, which give rise to questions we ought to discuss. I hope that you and your listeners find that useful.
Iain, it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very, very much. We really appreciate not only coming to tell us about the bard himself, to tell us about the poem, but what you said at the end there, it really is food for thought. One of the things I always thought curious about Burns was that he was such a terrible husband. He was such a terrible father. He was so bad to so many women, but wrote one of the most beautiful poems, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. It's bizarre that perhaps some of the men who could be the best men and love best in the world could never put that into words. Mm. But somebody who didn't necessarily show that in their life was so easily and able to write it. We hope you enjoyed listening to Iain Mc Sporran QC there telling us about how people thought of witches just after the witchcraft trials had ended. It's quite funny to get that description of them only such a short time after the Witchcraft Act had ended and people were being put to death as witches. But we see the terrible, horrible, grotesque and gory aspect to them. I don't think that Robert Burns shied away at all from putting in some of the most horrible parts of what women were being accused of in the poem. Moving on, we want to tell you a wee bit about what's happening next week. And in next week's show, we are delighted to be able to tell you that we've spoken to Rachel Newton and Lauren McCall from Heel and Harrow. This is a new project about witches and memorialisation of them in various forms through music and also in writing. And we had a great chat with them and we look forward to bringing you that next week.
Thanks so much for listening again to the Witches of Scotland podcast. As ever, please do follow us on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. Please sign up, because as the campaign progresses, the more people we have on board and who know what we're talking about and get involved, the greater chance of success that we have. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye. If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.